Today, we're digging into the fallout from something we all lived through but maybe haven't thought about since, the massive temporary boom in hand sanitizer production.
Right. Feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? The panic buying.
It does. But we're looking beyond that initial scramble. We're focused on let's call it the hangover, the market distortion, the environmental problems, the public health issues that this emergency response actually created.
We're diving into what our sources are calling the explosive legacy of the pandemic hand sanitizer boom. And when you hear that, think about this. It's been 3 years. And the real cost, the true cost, is only just now coming into focus.
Yeah.
It's a story that involves, a regulatory free-for-all, some seriously bad chemistry, and logistical nightmares with tons and tons of hazardous waste.
And the core of it, the real challenge, it came from the speed of the response. The government's goal was simple: get supply out there, fast. And, they succeeded in that.
They did.
But the way they did it, this emergency authorization framework, it created these huge, huge distortions. You get what economists call the Bullwhip Effect, plus this total failure of quality control.
So now, years later, we're left cleaning up the mess.
Exactly. We're dealing with the fallout in logistics, in public health, and especially in how we manage toxic materials. It's a classic case of solving one immediate problem by creating three massive long-term ones.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning then, the pivot. Because in early 2020, you couldn't find hand sanitizer anywhere. It was gone.
It was impossible. And that fear, that panic, it drove demand to just astronomical levels. The government's response from the FDA here in the States was basically to open the floodgates.
Your regulatory free-for-all.
That's the perfect term for it. The FDA temporarily relaxed all the standard rules, the really stringent stuff like good manufacturing practices, which, that's the rule book for how you make drugs safely.
All of that just went out the window.
Pretty much. They used something called the Emergency Authorization Framework, or EAF, and it was a deliberate move to prioritize speed and volume over everything else, over the usual rigor you need in drug manufacturing.
And this brought some really fascinating and completely non-traditional players into the game.
Oh, absolutely. Companies that had literally zero experience making medical products. But they did have experience with alcohol.
So you're talking about distillers, brewers?
Right. Those were the logical ones. They had the ethanol, they had the equipment, they retooled their facilities almost overnight. But it went so much further than that.
How so?
We saw luxury cosmetic giants jumping in. LVMH.
LVMH, as in Louis Vuitton and Dior?
The very same. And Beiersdorf, the company that makes Nivea, they were leveraging their chemical expertise to start pumping out sanitizer all across Europe and the U.S.
That's remarkable. So you have a company like Louis Vuitton suddenly operating under the same, emergency guidelines or lack thereof as a tiny micro distillery somewhere.
And they're all technically drug manufacturers at that point. But this speed, this rush, meant bypassing all the normal scrutiny. And that, as we're about to get into, set the stage for some massive chemical failures.
Okay, but that speed was driven by this incredible demand shock. The numbers you see in the reports are just staggering.
They really are. The initial panic just completely warped the entire global market for hygiene products. Nothing could have predicted it.
Let's run through some of them. In the UK, year-over-year demand for hand sanitizer shot up over 250%. In Italy, where the pandemic hit so hard and so early, that demand went up 1,800%.
1,800. It's almost not a real number.
And here in the U.S., just in 1 month, between December 2019 and January 2020, it surged over 1,380%.
And that vertical line on a demand graph, it translates instantly into market value. It shows you how quickly panic can inflate what something is perceived to be worth.
Right.
So before the outbreak, the global market for sanitizer in 2020 was forecast to be about, say, $1.35 billion.
Okay.
After that initial surge, the expectation spiked to almost $1.87 billion. That's a $500 million jump based almost entirely on fear and anxiety.
Which brings us to this core economic idea we need to unpack, the Bullwhip Effect. For anyone who isn't, deep into supply chain economics, can you break that down for us?
Yeah, of course. Think of cracking a whip. The person holding the handle, they only make a small movement with their wrist, right? A little flick. But by the time that energy travels all the way to the tip, it's a huge violent crack. The Bullwhip Effect is just like that. A small change in consumer demand, you buying 2 bottles instead of 1, it results in these exponentially larger, more distorted orders further down the supply chain.
So at the distributor, at the factory level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The initial ripple of consumer panic becomes this catastrophic tidal wave of overproduction.
That makes sense. But the sources use this term irrational ordering. I kind of want to push back on that a bit. In a once-in-a-century crisis, isn't that just rational self-preservation? How can you expect anything else when people are panicking?
That is such a critical point. And when economists talk about irrational ordering, they don't necessarily mean it's irrational for you, the individual. It's highly irrational for the system as a whole.
Okay, explain that.
Well, the human decision makers in the chain, especially the inventory managers at retailers and distributors, they overreacted to what they saw. They saw empty shelves and panicked customers.
So they just started ordering just in case.
Just in case.
Right.
Or they just completely lost track of what inventory they already had on the way. They were betting against scarcity, and that bet gets compounded at every single step.
So the retailer overorders, then the wholesaler sees that big order and overorders even more.
And the distributor triples that. By the time that signal reaches the thousands of new temporary factories, it's telling them to produce 100 times what's actually needed. Research shows that just putting a human decision maker in that chain is costly, and the cost is highest when that human is closest to the consumer at the retail level.
So the panic was amplified. The already inflated demand from people hoarding at home became this even louder, more distorted scream, telling factories to make an impossible amount of sanitizer, which, of course, guaranteed the massive glut that followed.
Precisely. And this really highlights a huge failure of information sharing. Think about how established mature systems work, like the data sharing between Procter & Gamble and Walmart.
Right.
P&G can see in real time when a box of their detergent gets scanned at the checkout. They know exactly what's happening. They have data. They have algorithms. They're far less likely to overreact to a temporary spike.
But the thousands of little guys, the temporary manufacturers, the FDA's emergency plan brought in, they didn't have that.
They had nothing. They were flying blind. They were just responding to these panicked, inflated orders coming from retailers. And that meant they overreacted massively, which made the oversupply problem, not just likely, but inevitable and much, much worse.
So if the economics of panic drove the sheer volume, it seems like the lack of quality control is what determined what was actually in the bottles.
That's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, kind of terrifying. When your only priority is volume, as fast as possible, things like good manufacturing practices, quality testing, ingredient sourcing, those are the first things to go.
You see the immediate and kind of visceral fallout from that regulatory speed.
You do. These manufacturers, new to the drug space, are suddenly operating without any of the normal inspections. The global supply chain is in chaos, and so they start cutting corners on ingredients.
Let's pivot to the chemical consequences of that, because the FDA recall lists we have, they paint a horrifying picture of what was inside some of these products.
The biggest and by far the most dangerous contaminant was methanol, wood alcohol.
Which should never, ever be in hand sanitizer.
Never. It's highly toxic. It gets absorbed through your skin. If you ingest it, it can cause permanent blindness, kidney failure, or death. But during the peak of the scarcity, methanol was cheaper and easier to get than pharmaceutical-grade ethanol.
So unscrupulous or just desperate manufacturers started substituting it.
Exactly. And the FDA recall lists show this was a global problem, but a lot of the early alerts, starting in mid-2020, pointed to manufacturers in Mexico.
Right, I saw that. Names like 4E, Global, Safety by DCV.
Yes, they recalled a whole bunch of products. Brands like Bloomin' and Clar and Danver, all contaminated with methanol. Another one, AAA Cosmetica, recalled their Bio Advanced Hand Sanitizer.
And these weren't niche products. They were sold in major U.S. retailers. Yeah. This toxic stuff was flowing through massive distribution networks.
But it wasn't just a foreign manufacturing problem, which is important to state. The rush to produce meant that companies right here in the U.S. were either making mistakes or just failing to catch them.
So this was happening domestically, too.
Absolutely. Open Book Extracts in North Carolina, they voluntarily recalled a product called Always Be Clean Hand Sanitizer because it was labeled to contain methanol. We saw distilleries that pivoted, like Leiper's Fork in Tennessee, have issues. Even larger chemical companies were flagged.
So the lack of proper ingredient vetting was just a systemic global failure.
It was. From Mexico to Poland to right here in the U.S.
And methanol is a terrifying, acute poison. But the recalls also unearthed other contaminants, things that point to a much deeper systemic failure of quality control. It goes beyond just substituting one alcohol for another.
That's where the crisis gets even more alarming, because then you start to see recalls for established carcinogens. We're talking about chemicals that pose long-term cancer risks, not just immediate poisoning.
Specifically benzene, which is a known human carcinogen and has no place in any consumer health product.
Correct. Benzene was found in products like CALA Advanced Hand Sanitizer made in Korea. Another Korean company, Mirfield Korea, had the same issue. And what's even more disturbing is when you see multiple contaminants in the same bottle.
Like what?
A company in Florida, Sensational Soaps and Candles, Inc., recalled several products, and they contained not only methanol and benzene, but also acetaldehyde.
And acetaldehyde is another really bad one, a probable human carcinogen linked to DNA damage.
Exactly. And this kept happening. Later in 2021, the popular brand ArtNaturals got flagged for unacceptable levels of benzene, acetal, and acetaldehyde. These are just severe, multiple failures in basic safety. It shows you how completely the normal guardrails were just gone.
So it wasn't just one bad actor, it was a whole system failing. And the contamination didn't stop there, did it? What else was turning up?
We also saw issues with another toxic alcohol, 1-propanol, found in some Mexican-made products. You saw acetaldehyde and acetal in products from places like Cathead Distillery and an ethanol plant in Iowa.
Yeah.
It was likely from poor distillation or just contaminated sourcing. It really shows that basic chemical safety checks were just non-existent.
So beyond the outright poisons, you have the simple question of whether the stuff even worked. If it wasn't actively poisoning you, was it at least killing germs?
And often, the answer was no. Efficacy failures were just as widespread as contamination. We saw so many products with subpotent levels of the active ingredient, the ethyl alcohol or isopropyl alcohol.
So you're using it thinking you're protected.
But you're just getting a false sense of security while potentially spreading germs. A company called Asiaticon SADCV in Mexico had products with dangerously low alcohol levels. If you need 50% to be effective and you're only getting 30, it's useless.
But the inconsistency was maybe the most shocking part. You had products that were both too weak and too strong at the same time.
It just highlights the absolute chaos in manufacturing. A company called Lavo Clean in Mexico had some of its products flagged for being subpotent in benzalkonium chloride.
Okay.
And then another size of the exact same product was flagged for being super potent.
Which is also dangerous.
Very. A super potent product can cause severe skin irritation, even chemical burns. That kind of inconsistency tells you the system is completely overwhelmed and unregulated.
And then there was the packaging. This is the detail that is just... it's the most shocking and relatable, I think. The risk this posed to children.
It's genuinely disturbing. The rush to just get things in a bottle, combined with a total lack of experience in drug labeling, led to some incredibly dangerous packaging choices.
Choices that made these things look like food or drinks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our sources list recalls for smart care products that were packaged to look like food pouches. You know the kind. With kids' characters on them. Arby, the Minions, Paw Patrol.
Oh, wow.
So you have this huge increased risk of a child accidentally drinking it because they think it's a snack. It's horrifying.
It's unbelievable to think that the bottle meant to save you from a virus was designed to look exactly like the juice pouch you'd put in your kid's lunch.
And it wasn't just pouches. Other manufacturers were packaging sanitizer in containers that looked just like water bottles. In that moment of panic, when we were all just grabbing whatever we could find, these poor design choices led to hundreds of poisoning incidents.
So it sounds like a regulatory nightmare that just kept going long after the initial panic was over. The FDA must have been playing catch-up for years.
For years. And you can see that in what they're doing now. If you look at the FDA alerts from just 2023, so very recently, many of them aren't even about new contamination. They're about this persistent lack of transparency from these pandemic-era companies.
What does that mean? What kind of non-compliance are we seeing now?
In many cases, it's dozens of manufacturers from China, Mexico, even places like Iowa and Turkey being put on import alert simply because they failed to respond to FDA requests.
So the FDA is asking for their records, their manufacturing data.
And they're just getting silence. Companies like Hygienic Labs in Iowa or Cosmolive Cosmetic in Turkey got warnings late last year because they just wouldn't provide the paperwork to prove they were following the rules.
So a failure to provide records is basically as serious as finding contamination because it means the regulators have lost all visibility. They have no idea if the product is safe.
That's it exactly. It's a signal that the sheer volume of this non-compliant product is still floating around the global system. And regulators are just trying to chase down firms that have essentially vanished or just refused to cooperate, leaving millions of gallons of potentially unsafe expiring product out there.
So we have this massive distorted volume of product. A lot of it is contaminated, ineffective, full of poisons or carcinogens, which brings us to the next massive problem.
Well,
How do you get rid of it all? This is the core of that explosive legacy we talked about.
this is where inventory turns into a huge liability. A school district, a hospital, a business. They're sitting on pallets of this stuff. It's expired, it's recalled for methanol. It's no longer an asset. It is now a severe hazardous waste problem.
And it doesn't just become trash, it becomes something very specific. D001 Ignitable Hazardous Waste.
That is the key classification. To be effective, sanitizer needs at least 60% alcohol. Many of these products were 70, 80, even 95% alcohol. That high concentration means it meets the EPA's definition for ignitable hazardous waste.
Meaning it can easily catch fire.
Easily. It has a flash point below 140 degrees Fahrenheit. It's essentially high-octane fuel, and it has to be treated with extreme caution.
And that D001 designation completely changes how you have to handle it. You can't use the easy, cheap disposal methods.
Correct. The federal and state rules under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, are very clear. And RCRA is the backbone of how we manage toxic materials in this country.
So rule number 1, you absolutely cannot just pour it down the drain.
Absolutely not. The Clean Water Act prohibits that. It's legally an ignitable hazardous waste. You can't put it into the sewage system.
And you can't just toss it in the dumpster either, right? Unless you're just, a household with a few old bottles.
Exactly. RCRA defines different levels of waste generators. If a business produces more than just 220 pounds of this waste in a month, which is only about 28 gallons of sanitizer,
That's not very much.
it's nothing. At that point, they become a small quantity generator, an SQG, and they fall under all these stringent regulations. They need manifests, trained staff, special storage.
So with the massive oversupply, basically every school, hospital, and big retailer in the country suddenly became a hazardous waste generator overnight.
They did, an SQG or even a large quantity generator. And this created a simultaneous massive surge in D001 waste volume all at once.
Which must have just completely overwhelmed the system.
It significantly strained the specialized downstream waste processing facilities. Our hazardous waste infrastructure just isn't built for that kind of nationwide simultaneous influx of pure ignitable fuel.
So let's talk about the legal ways to get rid of this stuff, because just storing thousands of gallons of ignitable waste on site, as the sources suggest many were forced to do, sounds like a huge fire risk.
It is. And there are really only 3 primary legal routes for these regulated generators. All of them are complex and none of them are cheap.
The first, and I guess the best option, is reclamation, recycling it.
Yes, that's the preferred method. It offers an exemption from some of the storage permit rules. If you can legitimately return the sanitizer to a manufacturer or a specialized recycler who can reclaim the alcohol, you're in a better spot.
So they basically distill the pure ethanol back out for reuse.
Right. But you have to prove it's legitimate. You need a strict manifest system to show it's not sham recycling, which is just pretending to recycle to avoid the fees. The problem was finding enough recyclers with enough capacity to handle that volume all at once.
Okay, so what's the second route?
That would be the episodic generation rule. This is a kind of temporary grace period for businesses that don't normally handle hazardous waste.
Which must have applied to thousands of these new temporary producers or retailers.
It did. It lets them temporarily go over their normal waste limits without getting bumped into a stricter, more expensive category. But there's a catch.
There's always a catch.
You have to notify the DEQ 60 days in advance, and you have to get the waste to a permitted facility within a very short time frame. It's an option, but it requires a lot of planning and regulatory know-how that a lot of these panicked organizations just didn't have.
And the final route is just the most traditional and most expensive one. Treat it as fully regulated hazardous waste.
Right. If recycling or the episodic rule don't work, it has to be sent to a permitted disposal facility, following all the RCRA rules, reporting, and fees. And given that it's ignitable, that waste is often channeled into energy recovery.
Energy recovery. So they burn it, but like legally and safely.
Correct. The alcohol has a high caloric value, so it can be used as a fuel source. It's a controlled process. They blend it with other materials and burn it for energy, usually at places like RCRA-permitted cement kilns, which have extremely strict emissions controls.
So it's a way to get rid of the hazard and get some energy back. But it's still a costly, highly regulated process.
Very. It still has to be tracked and transported as D001 hazardous waste. And that cost ultimately gets passed down to taxpayers or consumers.
And for places like hospitals or school systems, there's another layer of complexity on top of all that, right?
There is. Any sanitizer with a drug fast label that's being discarded by a healthcare facility has to follow the specific, very complex pharmaceutical rule. It's a whole separate subpart of the regulations.
This just makes the whole disposal process even more of a labyrinth for these organizations.
It does. It became a huge financial and logistical strain for so many institutions that were suddenly dealing with these mountains of recalled or expired product in 2021 and 2022.
So this all started as a response to a public health threat, but the ripples are creating these long-term sort of invisible debts, biologically and environmentally.
That's a great way to put it. And one of the most critical long-term concerns our sources identify is the potential amplification of antimicrobial resistance, AMR. We solve the immediate problem of spreading a virus only to potentially accelerate a much older, much deeper crisis with bacteria.
The idea that being hyperhygienic could actually lead to stronger superbugs. It sounds so counterintuitive, but the science seems to back it up.
It does. The massive and often irresponsible use of these sanitizers, especially the subpotent ones we talked about, coupled with the increased use of antibiotics in hospitals for COVID patients, seems to have enhanced the global AMR threat. And we have to remember, this is already a top 10 global threat, according to the WHO.
Let's put some context on that. How bad is AMR already, even before the pandemic?
It's severe. In the U.S. alone, the CDC reported that back in 2018, we had 2.8 million antibiotic-resistant infections. They resulted in over 35,000 deaths. And that was before any of this happened.
So how does using hand sanitizer specifically make bacteria more resistant to alcohol? What's the mechanism there?
It's pure natural selection in action. Bacteria develop resistance when they're exposed to a concentration of an antimicrobial agent that's just strong enough to kill the weakest bugs, but not strong enough to kill the slightly more resilient ones.
So using a weak or expired or contaminated sanitizer
Is the perfect training ground. It creates a survival advantage for the toughest strains. They survive, they reproduce, and they pass on that resistance. Over time, the entire microbial population becomes more resistant to alcohol.
So by trying to be clean, I might actually be training the bacteria on my hands to be stronger.
In a way, yes. You're applying evolutionary pressure, and we have evidence of this. Research from even before the pandemic showed that Enterococcus faecium, which is a leading cause of hospital-acquired infections, was already becoming more resistant to alcohol sanitizers.
Wow.
The pandemic's sudden, chaotic flood of product use likely just put that trend on fast forward, especially in hospitals. We might have sanitized our hands furiously, but we may have inadvertently selected for stronger bacteria in the process.
So moving from that microscopic threat to the global one, let's look at the environmental toll. The planetary health debt we took on just to keep our hands clean.
It's substantial. Scientists have actually quantified this. They found that the production and use of all these sanitizing gels contributed around 2% of our usual carbon footprint during that time.
2% doesn't sound like a lot on its own, but I imagine it adds up.
It adds up when you translate it into human cost. They use a measure called disability-adjusted life years, or DALYs. It's a way to quantify the true cost of ill health from environmental factors.
Okay.
And the analysis suggests that because of the planetary health impact of all these hygiene practices, people globally may lose between 16 and 114 hours of healthy life per year.
16 to 114 hours of healthy life lost every year. Because of this, that's a really powerful number. What goes into that calculation?
It's a whole web of interconnected costs. It's the carbon emissions from making the plastic bottles and the active ingredients themselves. That contributes to climate change and ozone breakdown, which impacts our health. But it's also the massive amount of water used for all the extra hand washing we were told to do. Every part of that emergency response had a planetary price tag.
Which gives us some really powerful policy lessons, right? We can't just react in the next crisis. We need to build sustainability and critical thinking into our emergency plans from the start.
That has to be the goal. And we have specific, actionable lessons here.
Okay, let's start with the economy. How do we stop that bullwhip effect, the irrational ordering and overproduction next time around?
The recommendation is pretty clear. We need centralized government procurement monitoring. And we need to incentivize industry data sharing, especially for those non-traditional players who jump in during an emergency.
So we can tell the difference between real demand and just panic buying.
Exactly. So federal agencies can dampen that bullwhip crack before it leads to another toxic glut of overproduced stuff. It means tracking what people are actually buying, not just what stores are ordering.
Okay, that handles the supply side. But what about the massive hazardous waste crisis? How do we prepare for the end-of-life problem?
We need a formal hazardous waste contingency framework. Regulators need to set up pre-approved standing agreements with specialized waste facilities, the big alcohol recyclers, the RCRA-permitted cement kilns. The goal is to secure guaranteed surge capacity for this exact kind of D001 waste before an emergency even happens.
And what about all the little guys? The small businesses, the schools, the ones most likely to just illegally dump this stuff because it's too complicated and expensive to deal with?
We have to make compliance the easiest option for them. That means standardized, simplified, and even subsidized hazardous waste manifests. It means setting up dedicated regional collection points for these very small quantity generators. You have to remove the barriers of cost and complexity.
And finally, we have to just get smarter about our public health messaging around hygiene itself.
Absolutely. Policy has to embrace a more sustainable hygiene strategy. We need to refine the messaging to promote good old soap and water as the primary preferred method for routine hygiene.
And reserve the high-alcohol sanitizers for when they're truly needed.
Exactly. For high-risk settings or places where soap and water just aren't available. Future emergency planning has to include these kinds of full life cycle assessments, so we always prioritize the most sustainable option when it's medically feasible. We have to plan for the full cost, from production all the way to disposal.
So what does this all mean?
The hand sanitizer boom is just this perfect case study. It shows how rapid deregulation, which is aimed at providing immediate emotional relief, can create these decades-long interconnected costs. We've ended up with huge debts in logistics, massive hazardous waste liabilities, and we've potentially accelerated long-term health threats like AMR. The global rush for volume just completely overshadowed quality, compliance, and any kind of long-term environmental planning.
It really shows a profound systemic vulnerability, doesn't it? One that's driven by human panic overwhelming our rational systems. The lessons here go so far beyond just alcohol gels. They speak to our deep reliance on these complex global supply chains and the real, quantifiable cost of our own irrationality on our infrastructure and our planet. The product that was supposed to protect us left a toxic, ignitable mess in its wake. And it potentially created a world where our most basic hygiene tools are now less effective against future threats. So here's the thought I want to leave everyone with. We know the Bullwhip Effect is driven by panic and a lack of good information. Now we have the hard data. We can see the immense human and environmental cost of that overreaction, the toxic waste, the carbon footprint, the years of regulatory catch-up. Are we, institutionally or even just individually, any better equipped to resist that exact same panic when the next crisis inevitably hits? It's a question of what we choose to prioritize. Immediate emotional relief or long-term systemic resilience, something to mull over until our next deep dive.